He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
I think, if you've won a number of titles, you remember your first, of course, very clearly and very dearly, and you remember your last. It was sort of a surprise and not a surprise. I knew I could do it. I just didn't think I thought I possibly might not do it that year.
Hi, I'm Jesse Mulligan, and this is Sports History NZ. Dame Susan Devoy was a multi-world champion in the sport of squash and a hero to many of us in the 1980s. In 1984, she won her first major title at the British Open against Lisa Opie, and we began our interview by listening to those exciting final moments.
8-1 match ball. So, this is the one. First Open Championship, is it, to New Zealand? Yes, it is. Opie has thrown her racket into the crowd. A very disappointed and unhappy young lady, but Susan Devoy of New Zealand, appreciated by this capacity crowd. And look at that. Members of the Oasis Club from Marlow in Butt saying, you're the number one. And what a marvellous, marvellous performance it was. Very workmanlike, if one can use that word. And Susan Devoy of New Zealand has done it, has won the title on her very first appearance.
Incredible. And Dame Susan Devoy joins me now. Hi there.
Good, Jesse.
Nice to have you on the show. Exciting to have you on the show. Do you remember that moment?
I do, actually. Not those details. I was having a little chuckle to myself.
Did you ever throw
very long time ago.
Sorry, we've got a bit of a delay on the line, so I'm going to try not to interrupt you too much. But did you ever throw your racket into the crowd when you lost?
No. Never anything that bad. In fact, I don't. I do recall only ever being very badly behaved once, early in my career when I was first in the UK, and my coach came on after I was mouthing a bit too much and said, if you say one more word, Susan, I'm going to rip your throat. You rip your tongue out of your throat and never coach you again. And from that moment on, I virtually said nothing.
Huh. Gee, that's tough. But why was Lisa so upset? I'm sure you've talked about it with her since.
Yeah, she had to make a public apology on the BBC following that and got suspended. But I think there was a lot of pressure on her. We were still quite young. That doesn't excuse it. But, it's called the British Open for a reason. And Britain won it for so many years. It was, had been dominated by Australians. And then I came along. So I think she just imploded in that moment. We laugh about it now.
You buried the hatchet at some point, hey?
Well, it wasn't personal. It wasn't against me. It was just her own. She was just taking out her own frustrations. It wasn't, some of it was directed at the referee, but she's not like that as a person at all, and never was. It was just the moment, and the pressure all came to bear at once.
Yeah, and just listening to that score in the commentary, 8-1 match ball. That doesn't even sound like it was close by that stage of the match.
No, but it was brewing, the whole tension was brewing and a few other things that happened during the match. But yeah, so the scoring's changed with squash now. In those days, we had to serve to win the point. Now it's point or rally. So I'd like to think it was that much harder back then, but not really.
Well, what did it mean to you to win that day?
I think, if you've won a number of titles, you remember your first, of course, very clearly and very dearly, and you remember your last. The other British Opens and World Championships are sort of a bit of a blur now, but, if that's what you set out to do in your sporting life, to be the best, and you achieve it. And look, we had everything planned. When I say we, my coach and I and everything, that really we thought the next year possibly I would win the British and the Worlds. But so everything just, happened earlier, and so it was sort of a surprise and not a surprise. I knew I could do it. I just didn't think I thought I possibly might not do it that year, but it would happen at some stage. So, yeah, a big thrill. That's your lifetime goal as a sporting person, to be the best or to win the British Open, which for us squashies was like, our poor version of Wimbledon. So, it was pretty cool back then.
What made you good?
To be honest, I just worked incredibly hard. I loved training as much as I loved competing. So, I just loved putting in the hours and hours and hours. And each day, well, not each day, but generally, I didn't wake up in the morning and think, hey, I'm a world champion, isn't the world a better place for having me? I used to wake up and think, what is going to make me better than I was the day before?
Oh, that's cool.
And even when I won big tournaments, it was like, I was delighted, but it was, and somewhat relieved as well, but it was always like, well, what's next, and wasn't the most flashiest player on earth. I was, as that gentleman said, fairly workmanlike, if you can say that these days. But I worked really hard. I was very fortunate. I didn't, I had a great constitution. I didn't get injured, had the ability to soak up lots of work. And I was mentally very tough.
Where did that mental toughness come from? Was that something you always had, or did you get toughened up along the way?
No, I was always pretty tough. I grew up in a large family as the youngest of 7, and I've got 6 older brothers. So you can imagine that, it wasn't all sweetness and light. And if I wanted to participate in things that they did, albeit I was quite a lot younger than they were, there was a lot of rough and tumble, and so there was nothing special about it. I was born like that, and I was a tomboy, and so it just was something that developed. And my mother was a tough woman, so I think it's in my genes.
Yeah. Karen in Christchurch has sent me a message. She says, please tell Dame Susan that I still have an unopened can of Coca-Cola with her picture on it. I was a big fan. Did you come back to New Zealand famous after that win?
Well, a little bit more famous than before I left, but that wouldn't have been hard. It was just, squash was really popular in the 80s and 90s. It's not so popular now, and it was on a bit of a roll, not only myself, but there was other really good New Zealand players, males and females, but particularly Stu Davenport and Ross Norman, who went on to win a world championship. So we enjoyed a sort of a different, well, we're starting to see it again in New Zealand now with Paul, Cole and Joelle and their success. But yeah, I was a big fish in a small pond, you might say, so I was pretty lucky, Came home and there was a little Honda City car for me, and lots of little endorsements, and they sort of grew as time went on. So yeah, I was pretty lucky because squash is a minority sport, and I was lucky to play in a time in New Zealand where I became sort of a well-known household name, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess. Well, you were the reason that a minority sport became famous. It wasn't the other way around. You were suddenly a sporting hero. What was it about that era that you and a couple of the men were doing well? Was there something about the way we were playing squash in New Zealand, or was it a coach?
Yeah, no, it was. We were very lucky that we had great coaching in New Zealand, but there was in particular a transformational time when they brought out to New Zealand an Egyptian coach called Dardia El-Bakari, and he coached everyone, and he coached the coaches. But there were lots of other people as well. Colin Brownlee, who started the first squash club up in Rotorua. So we were blessed with great coaching, but he made the real difference, and I think that's what we're lacking in New Zealand now. We need that injection again of how the game's played today, and that enthusiasm and inspiration and motivation. Paul and Joelle do it for our players, inspire our next generation, but who's going to coach our coaches to make our young people play like that? That's the challenge we face as an organisation, and I suppose why I've, got back involved with squash on a governance level, dare I say.
Of all the sports you could have played, netball is an obvious one. A young woman in the 1980s, hockey, but why was it squash?
I played all of those sports at a school level, and I really enjoyed them. I particularly enjoyed netball and tennis and athletics and other things. But squash was something we did as a family. So my 2 oldest brothers had left home by the time I came along, but the rest of us would travel around from weekend to weekend with our mum and dad and go to tournaments. My brothers were all, pretty good, and my mum and dad loved going watching them play at tournaments, and my mum and dad and my brothers loved sitting in the bar having a few beers. So I would just hop on the squash court and fill in the time by hitting squash balls, either with some other child who was in the same situation as me, but mostly on my own. So I just got hooked from a very early age, I suppose.
I'm talking to Dame Susan Devoy on our series on Great New Zealand Sporting Moments, and we're talking about some of the highlights of her career at the top of her game in the squash world. I didn't realise how young you were when you left school and turned pro. 17 years old. I mean, can you imagine one of your kids at 17 moving to the UK and leaping into the unknown?
No, I most certainly couldn't. I think as a parent I would be petrified. And I didn't really think about it until I reflected on occasions like this, realised how ambitious I suppose it was, or perhaps even a little silly. I can't believe my parents allowed me to do it. That's probably how adamant I was that I was going come hell, high or high water. But look, I left school in the middle of my seventh form year. I wasn't particularly interested in school in the first place. So, but I had an altercation with one of the nuns that taught me, and I was too scared to tell my parents I'd left school. So I hid under the house, got in my uniform and hid under the house for 3 weeks until I got spotted at the squash club, actually. So,
wow.
But my father said, find yourself a job. I think he thought in a bank or somewhere like that. And through a contact, I got a job as a builder's labourer, which was sort of making the cups of tea, actually, and getting the smoko and doing the odd jobs and painting. And I got enough money, plus a grant from the then Sports Foundation, and flew from Auckland to Heathrow. And I thought it was going to be like catching the bus from Rotorua to Auckland, but it wasn't quite like that.
Homesickness, was that the major problem, or just the isolation?
There was quite a lot of homesickness. Yeah, and, in those days we didn't have the technology to keep in contact like we do today. So a letter, those little blue aerograms used to get, they would arrive spasmodically, and the news would be 2 weeks old. We couldn't ring home because it was too expensive. And it wasn't just the homesickness, it was the sort of nomadic lifestyle, I suppose, of finding somewhere to stay when you went to tournaments. When you get billeted at tournaments or put up in a hotel, but the minute you lose, you're out. So it was finding the next place to go before the next tournament. And the reality was I went over thinking I was pretty good, in the scheme of things. But the reality was I was, really not starting at the bottom, but I got a few really good hidings repeatedly, and the confidence was knocked a little bit. So, yeah, it was a very challenging year, and not an easy decision to go back, but I got a coach and I got somewhere, a proper base, and then things happened from there.
Do I have this right? Did you actually live with Lisa Opie, that woman we heard you beating before? Did you live with her for a while?
I lived with her for the first year when I went over. We had met at the World Juniors in Canada sort of a few months earlier, and she offered me to go and stay, but in the same place with the same people that she was staying with. But it didn't necessarily work out because I think Lisa realised I was getting better and better and better, and became a little bit of not conflict as such, but everything in the club was provided for her, and I was the poor relation, so I needed to go and find my own stamping ground.
We heard that win of yours in the British Open. Obviously, that was one of the highlights, being your first. Could you pick another career highlight for us?
I think winning the World Champs here in Auckland in '87, I think it was. The opportunity to play at home in front of everyone and have all my friends and family being able to come, that was certainly a really cool event. And then my last World Championship in '92, I had a bad year in '91 and a whole lot of personal and professional, disappointments, and I nearly chucked it in at that end of that year. But I decided to have another go, and I couldn't have I didn't lose. Everything, went according to plan, and I was able to, retire on my own terms, having gone out, achieving everything I wanted. So, I was still quite young. I was only 29, but that's what I wanted to do. And so, I remember my first British Open and my last World Championship.
How different is it trying to get to number one versus trying to stay at number one?
Well, it's true what they say. It's always easier getting to the top than staying there. But, immediately you become number one, immediately you become number one, there's always, the ambition to stay there, not to make sure that it's, not a one-off, that you can continue to do that. But when you've done it 3 or 4 times, you think at the time that you're playing an event, oh, God, it couldn't get this harder. It couldn't possibly be this hard. And sure enough, the next year rolls around and it's, 100% harder. So everyone's striving to raise their standards to your standards so that they can beat you. And then so you've got to lift your game as well. And then you have to contend with the expectation and pressure that goes with being a number one. So, it's a different journey to getting to the top than it is once you are there and you're staying there. And also finding the motivation for why you want to keep doing it. I didn't necessarily worry whether I won 100 British Opens or 100 World Championships. I just wanted to be the best that I could possibly be. And I think champions search for perfect performances, knowing that's probably never going to happen, but that's what your motivation is, that knowing you can always improve something, get better. So that then becomes something against yourself rather than against your opponent. And I retired because I just knew, and the other thing, I worked hard, but I had to work hard to be the player I was. It didn't always come naturally. So I knew when I retired, I just didn't have that in me anymore. And, time to hang up my racket.
Was there a low point in your career that you can think of, one where, something went really wrong, unexpectedly wrong?
Yeah, in 1991, I lost in the quarterfinals of the British Open. I'd won the 7 years prior, and so it was a shock to everyone and a shock to me, actually. I went into a bit of a, embarrassingly so now when I think about it, but, went into a little mini depressive state. Pulled my socks up, got back together, and then I lost again a few months later in the Australian Open, and I was coming home to play in the New Zealand Open. I didn't realise at the time that I was pregnant, Caveat there is I've been married for a number of years. And I found out only a couple of days before the New Zealand Open, which threw me in a bit of a state because I hadn't been pregnant before. I didn't know whether to play, whether not to play, and, and I was quite a way along, so... And I made the decision to withdraw on the day of the New Zealand Open when my parents were driving up to watch me play, and my dad had a stroke behind the car wheel. He had a major stroke, and the irony was we were both in Waikato Hospital that night. He had a stroke and I had a miscarriage. And so it was a really sad and difficult time, but, much more so for him because he had this long period of recovery, of which he never really recovered, and then died not so long after. So, I felt a bit sorry for myself, but, made the decision that I was going to give it another crack. I know that's what he wanted, and I had some unfinished business. So, and I think that's, again, you feel much better about yourself knowing that you've faced some real adversity and actually being able to come back and do it all again makes you feel like, your achievements are even more special.
And I just want to clarify for you, you said you feel a bit embarrassed about having a depressive episode. I know you don't mean that it's embarrassing to have depression. I think you're just embarrassed that it was there was a loss on court that triggered that for you. And I know for a fact that you've actually spoken out about mental health and about how important it is to be open about it, and that's actually something you've devoted quite a bit of time to.
Yeah, I think we all have our moments, and doesn't matter at what level they are. That's, personal and important to the person. I followed the Naomi Osaka, the tennis player's story this year. I've always been thought of someone who's sort of an ice maiden, I think, mentally tough and all together and whatever. But, I suffered from terrible nerves, to the fact that people wouldn't even understand how debilitating they could be. I don't know sometimes how I even held that racket when I was playing, but
Really?
magically we used just to call it the glass elbow, because my coach and John could always know when it was coming. But miraculously, I just used to find ways to work through it. I mean, that's why I hit the ball so hard and fast in the beginning. That was to work out my nerves. But, and those nerves came from a fear of losing, and that's a horrible motivation to have too, I mean, we didn't have sports psychologists or sports science and all that stuff when I was playing. In fact, if you had to go and see a sports psychologist, people thought you were really nuts. That's a sort of stigma and sort of attitude back then, toughen up, get on with it, take some magic water and you'll be right. So that was one of the things I really, really relished when I'd stopped playing, was not to have that. It was just pressure. And I put the pressure on myself. It was nobody else, it just came from within. And I managed to win and work through it. But, I just think, and all I can think is thank heaven that there was no social media in those days, that I didn't have to be under that. Not that I would read it, because I've never read anything, I still don't, but that scrutiny of what other people's opinions or what they thought, I didn't. So I'm a lucky sports person. And, in those days we could say what we thought and not necessarily do what we liked, but we didn't have that intense scrutiny and pressure that they have today.
I want to mention that you fought for equity around pay between female and male squash players, and given that you were the big draw card back in those days, it might surprise people, not just the pay but the treatment of female players compared to male players.
Yeah, I mean, it was always pretty unequal, or inequitable, I should say. And I didn't really, of course, you don't really notice it until you get to the stage where you're winning decent prize money or half decent prize money. But it wasn't just the prize money; it was the manner in which women were treated. We were often billeted at private, places, or the men would stay in hotels. We'd find our own way there. They would always be transported and picked up, and it wasn't their doing. That's just the way that it was. The organisers organised things, and in particular, I suppose it irked me a little bit in New Zealand, because I was the draw card. I was the person who was attracting the sponsorship for these tournaments, and the likelihood I could play in a tournament where the men would win more than I would didn't seem to be incredibly fair. I took a pretty strong stand on that, and I'm pretty delighted to say that squash now does have equal prize money, and the men's and women's circuits are combined. So most of the tournaments are played, the women's and men's circuit together. And the greatest supporters of better prize money and better conditions for women have come from the men. So I think that's, really admirable.
You had a bit of trouble rallying support for your position back then.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. Not everyone wants to be, stand above the crowd. It's not the best place to always be. And there are a lot of people who are very vocal in the change rooms, but when it comes to being, publicly making a stand on something that's, a significant issue, you often find it's a lonely place to be, or that you don't have this sort of support out there for all to see. So, but, there have been plenty of pioneers and people that have gone before me doing great stuff like that, and it's sort of, something that I fought really hard for and was pleased, and then others get to benefit from it afterwards. So that's, it's not just, you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for, all the women that play the game.
Good for you. Why did you retire at age 29?
I think I said before that I was sort of a little worn out. I'd been a shorter, when I say it wasn't a shorter career, I'd been, as I said, on the circuit since I was 17. I was 29, was very keen to have a family, and I didn't want to leave it, too late. I wasn't sure if I could, if it was going to be easy to have children or whatever. And I'd set out to achieve, everything that I wanted and more. So, I wanted to do other things in life. I wanted sporting career is great. It's for a short period of time. The difficulty in being a sports person is you cram so much into that first part of your life that you've done a lot of things at 30 that the average person hasn't, you know. So I wanted to have a family and then see what else life could throw at me. And, you know, I'm going to be 60 in about 14 months' time. So it's been a game of two halves, and let's hope I've got another third to go.
Yeah, you did have children. You had 6 brothers, right? 6 brothers?
Yeah, I had 6 brothers, and now I have 6 brothers and no sisters, and now I have 4 sons and no daughters. So I've been punished for all the terrible things I've said about men in my life.
I don't know what the science is, but there must be something to that, right? The male genes, or something's going on. Why there are no daughters in the Devoy family apart from yourself?
Well, funny enough, ironically, my 6 brothers all had girls first, and predominantly girls. So that's a bit weird. But
okay.
It's funny that we should be talking today, because I say that strong women have boys, but my husband says that the male determines, the genes. So he'll take all the credit for having 4 boys.
Strong women have boys. That's interesting. And I should say, someone's just messaged in to say that your mum, if this is the right person, Tui Devoy, was a legend, that everyone respected her.
Oh, nice. Yeah, my mum was a legend. And funny enough, I've just been to Taupo this week, and I popped into the cemetery in Rotorua as I was driving through. I don't often do that. I don't often drive through it. And I went to visit my parents' graves. My dad has passed away 29 years ago this week, and my mum is 20 years. And today my husband is, and I'm not allowed, I hope no one's listening, but I have to say that he's 65 today. And we're going out. All he wants to do for his birthday, he wants to walk up Mount Maunganui, up Moau, and then he wants to swim in the sea, and it's bloody freezing. But you know what? He's such a cool dad, and our family of boys is so cool that they'll all come around and do that just for him, and it'll be the perfect way to celebrate a great birthday.
What's your husband's name?
John Oakley.
This is John this is John who you married when you were 21 years old.
Yep, that's the one. He needs a medal for hanging around with me, because I'm not the easiest person to live with. But so we've been married 36 years, coming up 37 years. So must be doing something right. But,
congratulations. I'm running out of time. I have to ask, do any of your boys play squash?
Yep, they all do. 2 boys went to the States on scholarships and got great degrees. And all the boys are off the bank of mum and dad at the moment. And, so they're all playing squash. But they love their golf. That's probably the thing they do most at the moment with their father, because he pays their green fees.
Gee, that's done all right. Good for you.
Exactly.
What a pleasure. I could spend loads more time talking to you, Dame Susan, so let's find another excuse. But thank you for taking us back on your squash career. I've enjoyed it so much. Thanks for your time today.
Cheers, Jesse. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sports History NZ, and a special thanks to Dame Susan Devoy for being my guest. Sports History NZ was produced by Melita Tull, Ayana Piper-Helian, Sally Ward and Sam Hollis. The podcast was put together by Justin Gregory. Tim Watkin is RNZ's executive producer of podcast and series. And there are plenty more amazing stories just like this one from our sporting past for you to follow and listen to. You can find them at Apple Podcasts, iHeart, Spotify, or wherever you found this podcast.